good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm glad you could make it to this webinar. Some of you may have joined us 2 weeks ago when we talked about flexibility demand, flexibility options in the German power system and beyond. Today we are presenting results from the same project we did for the German government on framework conditions for flexibility options like framework conditions for storage, demand side management, also flexibility of power plants. And this analysis of framework conditions builds on the modeling work that we did in this project, and also tries to use the results from that. We've structured the presentation as follows. I also would like to say that when we talk about framework conditions, we are not going to provide a detailed legal analysis, but rather provide some general principles that should be used and applied when designing framework for flexibility. And these general principles we present along the following lines. First, we present some general conclusions from our modeling work that is relevant for the design of framework conditions. Then we talk about framework conditions for reducing flexibility demand rather than just framework conditions for developing new flexibility options. I think this is an important first step. Then we talk about coordination between network and market, because all kinds of flexibility options, generation, demand side management, storage, can be used both for the network and for the market. Then we talk about a level playing field that should be created in our view, and which requires removing various barriers for the different options. Then we briefly touch upon the issue of sector coupling. That means using renewable electricity in other sectors and what this implies for framework conditions. We'd also talk about support schemes for renewables and what should be taken into account there. And then the question if we also should introduce support schemes or mechanisms for flexibility options. Just to give you a short impression of our modeling results, this is a residual load curve for Germany that comes out of our model. This means that it includes the flexibility options that are already in place. On the left, you can see a capacity shortfall. This is the area where there is not enough capacity or there is not enough flexibility to meet this shortfall. On the right-hand side, you see a surplus of generation, which basically means a surplus of renewable generation. And in the middle, you can see that generation and demand are already balanced, which means that existing flexibility options like flexible power plants, pump storage in Germany, quite important, can already balance supply and demand. And this is shown for 3 scenarios for Germany: for a 40% renewable scenario, roughly meaning 2020, 60% renewable scenario, which is 2030, and 75%, which is 2050, roughly, just to give you an idea. So from this, we have concluded that looking at the 2020 scenario, the blue line, there is not much flexibility, additional flexibility demand, neither in the sense of a capacity shortfall that would have to be met, nor in the sense of a generation surplus on the right-hand side that would need to be integrated with additional flexibility options. So not much flexibility demand, additional flexibility demand in 2020. Then the next slide that some of you may have seen 2 weeks ago, which presents different flexibility options that can be used to meet that demand. That's for the 2030 scenario, showing network expansion, showing different storage options, pump storage, compressed air, also showing different types of demand side management. I'm not going to explain this in detail, but just to make the point that in order to meet the flexibility demand that is here shown on the left as deficit in Germany, there are lots of different options available that can be combined in different ways to meet that demand. And from this analysis, we came to this conclusion shown on the next slide, which summarizes 3 phases of the development of flexibility demand. 2020, the first phase, there is no deficit, as I've just shown, very low surpluses, basically no surpluses, and which means that new flexibility options that come into the system basically compete against existing options, but they are not really absolutely required to run the system. Then in phase 2, flexibility demand increases. There are relevant surpluses, and also the deficit becomes really relevant. But there are sufficient flexibility options available, in principle, technically available, that can be used to meet that demand. And then in phase 3, which is quite some time to go, we see that longer-term deficits become relevant, which means that long-term storage, and this is typically power to gas, becomes relevant in this phase, but this also means it doesn't become relevant before that. So this is just a brief summary of the modeling results, which for us was important to then also come to conclusions as for the design of framework conditions. The following slides tries to summarize the kind of situation we are in, or the tension we are in. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, which I've just tried to show, new flexibility still has a very low system value, now especially talking about 2020, so basically now, what we have to do now. So low system value of additional flexibility because it competes against existing options and because it mainly competes through higher efficiency, so the system gains are not that significant. And for that reason, we also have to say that if it's difficult at the moment to develop flexibility options, to develop business models for flexibility options, this is not just because the framework conditions are wrong, but also to some extent because there is just a very low system value of flexibility. So it's even if you change the framework conditions, there is not much to gain from additional flexibility. So that's one side of the coin. On the other hand, we know that we need to develop flexibility options. They will become relevant, more relevant in the future, as we've seen in the 2030 scenario, maybe even before that. And I've shown you the one slide with the different bars, the different options. We can say that many options are available in principle. They don't require a lot of basic research, but still they need to be brought to the market. They need to be brought to a development stage where they can actually function. So there is some development need to actually fulfill flexibility demand in the years to come after 2020. And for that, I mean, some people may say the market will incentivize flexibility options. If there is a price signal, if there is a price spread, then there's also a signal for flexibility to come into the market. And the question really is that sufficient? Can we rely on price signals, on price spreads in the market, or are there other actions we need to take? But before we start talking about different flexibility options and framework conditions, we also would like to make the point that it's quite important to also talk about reduction of flexibility demand in the system. So it's certainly important to talk about storage and how we can develop storage, but before that we need to talk about how the general market design needs to look like in order to reduce the flexibility demand in the first place, which also means obviously that we need to make efficient use of options that are already in place. And we've given you 3 examples here that we consider relevant. There are more examples, just to make the point. The first one is linking different markets. A lot of flexibility is used in the balancing market to balance supply and demand from a system point of view. But it's becoming more and more difficult to actually say how much capacity is needed in the balancing market if you have an increasing share of renewables and where the demand for balancing capacity is not as predictable and not as fixed as it used to be. But it very much depends on how wind and PV generation actually develops as you move closer to real time. And therefore you may have booked a lot of balancing capacity that you then find out you actually do not need when it comes to starting the balancing market. And the question is, should that flexible capacity be fixed in a balancing market, or could it not be made available to other markets, namely the intraday market, that can then use this flexibility rather than locking it into the balancing market? So that would be one example of a changing market design that uses flexible capacity more efficiently. A second example is the efficient use of European interconnectors. This is also something that came out of our analysis, where we also modeled the European grid as a flexibility option, and where we've seen that in many cases the interconnectors, the available capacity is not used up to their full potential, up to their full capacity. And so again, this would be an example, rather than just extending the network, extending the infrastructure, it's quite important to fully use the capacity that is already there. And one approach here would be to use flow-based trading, which means that the actual capacity that is made available is not just fixed in advance, but is much more based on the actual flows on the system. And so there's much more flexibility there to use the capacity to its full potential. And the third example I would like to give here is the question on which level you use flexibility. Do you use it on a system level? This is also related to network extension. Do you have the network to do that, or do you use it in a smaller balancing area? And a case in point here would be using flexibility, for example, small-scale battery, to increase the level of self-consumption of individual consumers that have a PV installed on their roof and use a battery to increase the level of self-consumption. From a system perspective, this means that the overall flexibility demand increases, because then each consumer basically balances itself, and you cannot use the synergies between different consumers and generators. So from a flexibility perspective, market design should enable larger balancing areas and avoid these kind of small-scale activities. And again, this would be a contribution to reducing the flexibility demand in the first place, before we then come to the question how we can bring flexibility options to the market. Then the next question I think we have to look at is what's the role of flexibility between network and markets? What's the role of grid operators as storage operator? There are quite a few people who argue that storage is some kind of infrastructure like the network, and should therefore belong to the network and should be operated by the network operator, arguing that the grid operator is the one that has a lot of information available on the grid and can therefore use this flexibility, can use storage most efficiently. But the first question then that comes to mind is, should the grid operator only be a storage operator? And what about the level playing field that we will discuss later between different storage, between different flexibility options? Why should the grid operator only use storage as a flexibility? What about flexible power plants? What about flexible consumers? And if you continue thinking along these lines, then you end up with a system where you basically completely reintegrate the different steps of the value chain, and everything should be operated by the grid operator or the system operator, including all the flexibility options. Our argument would be that we shouldn't weaken unbundling, but rather establish a mechanism for coordination between market and the grid. And on the next slides, we have summarized different kind of options that we have in principle, or different options we could look at. The first question is, who operates the flexibility? Who owns the flexibility? Is it the grid operator, or is it the market, a market actor? That's on the left-hand side in the column. and then the other two columns differentiate between how is the flexibility option actually used. Is it operated in a grid-oriented way or in a market-oriented way? And this gives you these four options. The first one in the top left-hand corner would be the grid operator is also the flexibility operator and operates the flexibility from the grid point of view, from what is needed for the grid. If you have a network congestion, for example, I think this is something that should only be done under very special circumstances. If you really can, in specific situations, avoid a network expansion, if you do that. But in general, I think it becomes quite difficult because if you use flexibility options only from a grid point of view, then the efficient development of flexibilities is harder to achieve because it will sit there, a storage plant will sit there and will be operated by the grid operator, but the question is what does it do the rest of the time and how can it be used the rest of the time? Then the solution for that would be to also operate in a market-oriented way, but this becomes quite problematic, as I've just tried to explain, if the grid operator is a flexibility operator. So this means the grid operator has a storage plant and operates this on the market, and this would basically mean to get rid of unbundling, because there the question is why should the grid operator become a flexibility operator in the market, which basically means vertical reintegration of the electricity sector. Then the third option, which from our point of view should be the preferred one in the bottom right-hand corner, which is basically what we have at the moment. Unbundling flexibility options are mainly dispatched on the market based on market prices, on market signals. So this should be the preferred option and should remain the preferred option. But the question is then, what about a situation where the grid operator could also make use of flexibility options? In this case, this should still be possible, and there should be the possibility to correct market signals, and should be the possibility for the grid operator to interfere into the operation of a flexibility of a storage plant of DSM if it's necessary from the grid point of view. And the question is, what kind of coordination mechanisms do we have in place? One option is, for example, this traffic light approach where we have three phases, green, yellow, and red. In the green phase, everything is fine, no problem from the grid point of view. In the yellow phase, there is a need for the grid operator to intervene, but it should still do this market base. And in the red phase, it's really time for the grid operator to interfere and not take into account any market signals any longer, because this is really where it becomes problematic for the grid. But this kind of ensures that flexibility options are really used primarily market-based and then only in certain situations from the grid point of view. So this was about where should flexibility options be used, and now we come to different approaches to bring flexibility options into the market, and I hand over to Moritz.
Yes, thank you very much, Dirk. When we develop flexibility options and integrate those to the system, we have different approaches which we can use. There is, on the one hand, price signals we can use. Price signals signal flexibility providers and flexibility options that their action is needed in the system, or that flexibility providers should enter the system. Price signals might occur in times of excess or scarcity in the electricity market when prices are very high or very low. That means there can be revenues achieved in shifting electricity from low to high prices by flexibilities. Another option is the reduction of barriers. That means even if there are price signals that indicate flexibility is needed, there might be barriers that hinder flexibilities in entering the market. This might be, for example, participatory conditions for certain flexibilities. For example, offer sizes or offer durations, which cannot be achieved by all participants, or taxes and levies, as we will see later in the presentation. Research and development is another possibility Research and development decreases the cost for flexibility options to act in the system and might increase their ability to compete with other technologies. This might happen, for example, in increasing the load gradients, the possible load gradients of flexibilities and their ability to act in the market. Especially in the future, this will be very important. At last, there is specific support for different technologies that might come into place. When supporting flexibility options, specific technologies gain payments for either shifting electricity or providing positive or negative capacity in the system. From our point of view, research or development is highly favorable over specific support because it does not distort the competition between the options. When integrating flexibilities to the system, it is highly necessary that a level playing field state is remained at all times. A level playing field state is defined as a state in which each actor in the system has the same possibilities in competing and participating in the market. As you can see in this picture, the both teams do not compete under the same conditions. The team on the left-hand side is highly favored over the team on the right-hand side. Comparable conditions can be found in the German electricity system as well and need to be addressed to efficiently integrate flexibility options. In this table, you can see different barriers for flexibility mechanisms in the German system. There are, for example, levies and taxes as well as network charges that are raised on the consumption or storing actions of storages in the system. Although these levies and taxes might be right in terms when you're a consumer, they're not right for storages because storages shift electricity rather than consuming it. Affected by this barrier are storage technologies as well as all power-to-X options, for example, power-to-heat or power-to-gas, and increase problems for them to act in the market. Another barrier is the balancing market design. Offer sizes and durations vary between the different balancing markets. For example, you have to provide at least 1 megawatt of flexible capacity over a duration from 1 day to 1 week. These durations and sizes might not be fitting for smaller flexibility mechanisms and may hinder these to enter the market, thereby increasing the overall flexibility needs in the system. When it comes to electricity providers, they implement private households with a standardized load profile in their system. That means that they see every private household as the same consumer and thereby assume them as totally unflexible. This is obviously not right. In the future, it is necessary to make these consumers flexible and activate them in the market, and thereby enable providers to make use of the flexibility in their systems. The network charging structure, especially for bigger consumers like industrial consumers, depends on the hour with the highest demanded capacity in the year. That means if a big consumer, an industrial consumer, increases his consumption in time of excess renewable generation, he increases his network charges for the other times of the year and thereby makes this option highly unfavorable because it increases his costs immensely. This definitely needs a restructuring. Capacity mechanisms in future systems will need to take into account flexibility options. When payments are made for power plants, such as coal lignite or gas power plants, flexibilities has to receive payments as well so that a level playing field state can be maintained. The question is as well, if we indicate a level playing field approach for storages and they don't have to pay levies and taxes, what do we do for industrial consumers if they act in a way and that stabilizes the network state? How can we achieve a level playing field state here as well? It can be noted that flexibility demand only increases step by step, but nonetheless, it is necessary today to increase the possibilities of flexibilities to enter the markets. Thereby, we have to remove barriers before considering additional support mechanisms for more flexibilities. At the moment, there are plenty of flexibility capacities in the system. In the future, more than today, sector coupling will come into place and new electricity consumers will enter the system. This is a way that RESE can substitute conventional electricity in new consumption sectors. New electricity consumers might be power to heat, power to gas, or e-mobility. When these actors enter the system, they create electricity demand and inflexibility. Electricity demand because before they entered the system, they used other energy supplies and not electricity. Inflexibility because concerning especially e-mobility, there are always times in which this flexibility or this new consumer cannot act flexible. This creates, on the other hand, needs for the system. Especially new RESE capacities has to be thought of if new consumers enter the system, as well as flexibilities that can compensate the inflexibilities of the new electricity consumers. For the future, we can note that only renewable electricity should be used in other sectors. For example, night storage heaters cannot currently be considered as renewable heat as they consume electricity at nighttime, for example, where lignite is producing the most. And future consumers and increasing RESE demand have to be taken into account when defining RESE targets and instruments in the future. Back to you, Dirk.
Yeah, okay. So I'm coming to the final two slides now. The next one is on the question of design of financing instruments or support instruments, if you like, for renewable electricity. There is quite a fierce debate what this should look like. We have different systems. We have quota systems. We have feed-in system. We have premium systems, and all of these are being developed in different ways. Now you may ask, why is this debate relevant here in the context of flexibility options and framework conditions for flexibility options? We are talking about this here in this context because renewables are also often presented as a flexibility option, which is then used as an argument as to why support or financing mechanisms for renewables should be developed further. And it is often argued that renewables should not be operated in a separate market, in a feed-in system, but should be integrated into the normal competitive market so as to exploit their. So the question is, what kind of flexibility can renewables, and I'm talking here about variable and intermittent renewables, PV and wind. I'm not talking about biogas plants, for example, which obviously have flexibility. But in the case of PV and wind, the question is, what kind of flexibility can these plants actually offer if they are integrated into the market, if they have to react to market signals? And the point we would like to make is that in operational terms, the flexibility these plants can offer is mainly to just turn them off, which is mainly relevant in times of surplus generation. So, as we have seen in the previous slide that I showed before, as a modeling result, this residual demand curve on the right-hand side, you see the surplus generation, which in our 40% renewable scenario, which is, I would say, still relatively high for most countries, there is not much surplus, which also means that there is not much potential for renewables to be shut down in order to deal with that surplus. So this leads to a couple of conclusions. Operational flexibility mainly relevant in times of surpluses. This occurs only in a few hours of the year for the time being. It may change in the future. It will change in the future. But from this point of view, for the time being, the question is, do we need to exploit this flexibility of renewables, and how can we do that? Does a complete market integration of renewables with a full price risk and a full balancing risk as well make sense in this context? Or should we rather develop other mechanisms which can provide some kind of market signal without really exposing renewable generators to that complete market risk, which then also has other consequences like increasing their costs, increasing their financing costs and so on. So are there other options than a full market integrations? Can we, for example, talk about a system where the feed-in tariff does depend on the development of the market price over the day, for example, but still renewable plants are not fully exposed to the full market risk, for example, not to the balancing risk? Or would it be possible to have a mechanism where in times of negative prices there is no support, because then you have really a situation where you have a surplus generation and you can argue that you do not need renewables on top of that and they should be turned down. So I think this is, from our point of view, the way to go, that rather than fully exposing renewables to the market price, there should be these kind of mechanisms that balance exposing them to the market with still limiting their risk, and limiting their risk to a level that fits with their availability, their potential to provide flexibility. So in that sense, there is a link between the renewable support debate and the flexibility debate. And then on a final slide, I would like to come back to the point that Moritz has already mentioned before. This would be kind of the strongest option to support flexibility options. Now, flexibility options in general, again, storage, demand-side management, rather than just relying on market price signals, price spreads, and rather than just relying on removing the barriers. Moritz has presented some of the most important barriers. You could go one step further and say we also need support mechanisms to really bring flexibility options into the market, like we have done quite successfully with renewable technologies. The same you could do for flexibility options, storage, demand-side management. In our point of view, the emphasis really should be on the reduction of the barriers that we have shown. There are other barriers, but I think these are some of the most important ones. And if we talk about support for renewables, this should focus on research and development support rather than market introduction. And the reason for this simply is that, as we have tried to argue for the time being, there is no urgent demand for these additional flexibility options. Therefore, we should start with removing these barriers and see how this works and how this can help to bring them into the market. And what is also important, we would generally argue that there shouldn't be a specific support mechanism like a flexibility feed-in scheme or whatever. But what is also important, if you introduce some kind of support scheme, it should certainly be technology neutral. For example, in Germany, we have a scheme at the moment that supports decentralized battery storage. And we would ask the question, why decentralized, which increases overall flexibility demand, as I've tried to argue before, and why just battery storage? Why not other flexibility options? What about a level playing field between these options? And if you introduce some kind of support scheme, then, and I think that's quite obvious, it shouldn't be on the basis of the amount of electricity generated. For renewables, you can do that. You have some kind of tariff, feed-in tariff for the amount of electricity generated. You shouldn't do that for storage and other flexibility options, because that increases the incentive to maximize the use of the flexibilities, and that's something you do not want. You do not want to increase the use of a storage plant above the level that is efficient, because every time you use it, you have efficiency losses. So that's something to bear in mind. And also, next to the general argument that we wouldn't introduce support schemes for renewables, given the demand situation, at this stage, it is certainly not necessary to introduce some kind of support for long-term storage. We often hear the argument that this will be a very important option, long-term storage, power-to-gas plants, and that they should therefore be supported in some way or the other to bring them into the market. But if you look at the modeling results, at least from an electricity sector perspective, these options won't become necessary before we move to 75% renewables. So there's still some time to go. You may want to bring these options into the market earlier on because they are used for the sector coupling that Moritz has discussed. But from an electricity sector point of view, what kind of storage demand do we have there? These long-term storage options are certainly some time ahead, and therefore we wouldn't introduce support schemes, especially for these technologies. And this is the end of our presentation, and we are looking forward to your questions.
Okay, good.